Good evening, everybody. My name is Christoph Möllers. I'm a permanent fellow here, and I may, on behalf of the rector, welcome you tonight. All of you, but especially the members of the Beirat who are here, because this is basically a little present for the Beirat, who is helping us to select fellows and doing a lot of work without which we couldn't really pursue our task of having this wonderful institution. It's my special pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Lea Ypi, fellow of this year. It's a little bit too much of a microphone, perhaps. Fellow of this year and professor of political theory, the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Lea Ypi was born and grew up in Albania, went to school there, and already as a teen published works of poetry and short stories, as I took from her CV, but went for her academic education to Italy. She made a master's degree in philosophy at La Sapienza in Rome and a master of journalism there too. Went to the European University Institute in Fiesole, where she obtained a doctorate degree in philosophy, and then went to Britain, first to Oxford, becoming a fellow and a tutor for some years, and then to the London School of Economics, where she's now professor in the Department of Government. Though being quite young, she already has obtained a lot of prizes, awards, and fellowships I do not want to mention here, but it's fair to say that she has already become a household name in political theory and that she's just one of the authors you have read or see quoted in the field of normative political philosophy. Seeing her here as a fellow, one sees that Lea is a true European. She speaks Albanian, German, French, English fluently, and her growing up she seems to be very easy in many contexts that somehow constitute our very heterogeneous continent. And watching her at the Vico, you always also notice that she's a very political person, that politics is something that is somehow dear to her heart, not only as a matter of theory, but also as a matter of, well, your life form. Lea Ypi is a political philosopher, and the emphasis is on both, equally. She's a political philosopher, and what is interesting about her work is that this tension between the two, the tension between thinking in political terms, and which means somehow thinking in practical terms, in the terms that are relevant for action on the one hand, and thinking in philosophical terms, in terms of conceptual clarity perhaps, are both somehow upheld to an equal degree. This tension defines the style of her thinking as well as its topics. On the one hand, Lea stands in the tradition, one might say, of left Hegelianism. Marx is looming in her texts. She talks about progress and about avant-garde politics. On the other hand, it seems to me that she's very much coined by a Kantian tradition. The way she thinks, the very careful, analytical, sometimes a little bit dry style of her argument, but above all, the methodological individualism she pursues. She might pursue with a critical perspective, but still pursuing as the central point of departure of her argument. One of my favorite papers of Lea is entitled "The Myth of Self-Ownership in a Democracy," and the thesis basically is that this very appealing idea that you belong yourself, so you are your own, and that is somehow a good point for a normative argument, doesn't really work in a democracy, in which you have basically to justify all your actions, on the scope of all your actions with regard to the scope of actions of all the other participants of the political system. Front and center of her works make this tension between the political and the philosophical explicit. So, she writes about things like, why do we need borders? When we should, as a matter of an ideal argument, be all egalitarian and live in a cosmopolitan world? And above all, why should we need a state when states are basically political associations that draw borders and make distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, members and non-citizens, though there is basically no normative justification for that. Her point again is to say, well, states are one of the crucial conditions for any form of political actions, and our only possibility to pull off something that might live up to truly egalitarian standards is to work with institutions that allow for political actions like states. So again, the political and the philosophical are intertwined in a normative argument that takes the non-ideal conditions of the political action seriously and don't belittles them, as it's, to my mind, often done in political theory. One of the big topics, of the big problematic topics of democratic theory, one of the conspicuously absent topics in democratic theory that is so practically relevant are political parties. Political parties seem to be factions that somehow are pursuing their own interests. We cannot really square them with our idea of democratic self-government as something that is rational, that is somehow pursuing the common good, and so on and so forth. And yet, there are no democracies without parties. How can we solve that puzzle? Lea might tell us tonight. Thank you very much.
Lieber Herr Rektor Giuliani, sehr geehrte Mitglieder des Beirats, liebe Fellows, liebe Partners, liebe WICO-Mitarbeiter, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, vielen Dank, lieber Christoph, für diese überaus freundlichen Worte der Einführung. Es ist mir eine große Freude und Ehre, den heutigen Vortrag am Vorabend des Beiratstreffens zu halten. Ich habe mir vorgenommen, diesem Vortrag ein schmal zugeschnittenes Thema zu widmen, dem Verhältnis von dem Ganzen zu seinen Teilen im Kontext der griechischen Polis bis zum modernen Staat, nur bis zum modernen Staat. Keine Angst, das ganz so großformatig ist das nicht. Ich beziehe mich auf eine sehr spezifische Art von Teil und Ganzen, die Rolle von Parteien innerhalb einer politischen Gemeinschaft. So now my efforts to show off well German have climaxed, and my joke somehow succeeded. So I think I'll proceed with a language that I'm much more comfortable with, which is Albanian. Actually, no, with French. I'll start with French. Le terme parti, par lui-même, n'a rien d'odieux. Celui de faction l'est toujours. The term party has nothing despicable in it. That of faction always is. It's with these words that Voltaire's contribution to the encyclopédie that was edited by Diderot and d'Alembert started coining a definition and a distinction, that between party and faction, that all modern attempts to endorse partisanship have since then unfailingly endorsed. This endorsement is actually not surprising. Although the analysis of partisanship as a practice essential to democratic representation is a modern phenomenon, the critique of partisanship and the assimilation of parties to faction has been with us for much, much longer. Now, defenders of partisanship have always been aware of this critique and conscious of the need to address it. So, in what is now considered one of the first arguments in favor of the modern party representative system, Edmund Burke suggested that it was easy to distinguish between what he called the generous contention for power based on honorable maxims that characterize principled partisans and the mean and interested struggle for place displayed by vulgar political actors. Almost exactly 100 years later, another classic defense of parties, that offered by a 19th century jurist called Johann Caspar Bluntschli, tackled the distinction in no ambiguous terms. We need to distinguish between party and faction, he said. A faction is a distorted party, a denatured parties. Party, he argued, and parties are necessary and useful at the higher levels of conscious and free public life. Factions are unnecessary and corrupting. Another 100 years later, John Rawls, in his theory of justice, also relies implicitly on a distinction in a book that doesn't actually have a lot to say about parties, where he says that parties are not just interest groups petitioning the government on their own behalf. They must instead advance a conception of the common good. So those who defend partisanship tend to hold on to this distinction between parties and factions. Those who criticize them try to undermine parties, say that they're basically the same and that the distinction is a fragile one. For defenders, parties contribute to the development of the public good, factions undermine it. For critics, factions and parties both represent partial associations that advance conflicting commitments and are therefore seen as incompatible with the development of a collective will. Both these lines of argument have a venerable history, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history in a moment. For defenders of partisanship, parties are oriented to an ideal aim, which promises to benefit everyone. Factions try to achieve improper and selfish goals. For critics, like the revolutionary Saint-Just, every party is criminal, and every faction is also criminal. So some people celebrate partisanship because they complete the state, and some complain that factions rip it apart, and these two tend to coincide. Others, on the other hand, critics of partisanship, like George Washington, warn us, quote, in the most solemn manner against the baneful effect of the spirit of party and the domination of one faction over another, unquote. So for those who criticize partisanship, the difference from factions is only a difference of degree. For those who appreciate its virtues, the difference is a difference in kind. But what explains the difference? And what accounts for this apparent similarity? So let me begin answering this question with a brief excursus into the origin of the terms party and faction. The term party began to circulate in the early Middle Ages in French, Italian, and German, and comes from the Latin pars and the verb partire, which means to divide or to set apart. Before its use in the 18th century to denote political parties as we know them, as key actors in the modern representative system, it was used in political context to refer to associations or groups of people consolidated around different leaders and following different aims. And so people, for example, used to talk about the party of Caesar or Pompey, or the party of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The term faction, on the other hand, comes from the Latin verb facere, which means to do or to act, and factio can be translated as a way of acting. As Voltaire's entry for the encyclopedia that I have just cited clarifies, the term circulated with reference to both a certain posture or way of being active, so for example it denoted the place occupied by a soldier in post, en faction, but also the seditious activity of a politically motivated group within a community. Both terms, party and faction, are usually translated as synonyms with the Greek stasis, whose use is wider, but which in its root sense means placing, setting, standing, and therefore, similarly to faction, both occupying a specific position and acting in a certain way. So like the term faction, stasis was deployed from very early on, roughly 600 BC, in specifically political contexts to refer to both adopting a political position as well as to disagreement, dispute, internal conflict, struggle for power, revolution, and even civil war. You can see things get hotter and hotter until they explode. It's interesting to see how, for the Greeks, a term which initially had originally neutral connotations of staticity, settlement, and permanent occupation of a place or station lost such neutrality when applied to political contexts. Taking sides, maintaining a position, adopting a stance, are all attitudes that we tend to link to the spirit of partisanship. They all seemed then to be immediately associated with the threat of division, the disruption of political community, a conflict for power, and the worst excesses of sedition, civil war, and revolution. Nowhere is this critique captured better than in Thucydides' rendition of the conflict between pro-Athenian and pro-Spartan groups that tore apart the island of Corcyra at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Opposing partisans, all claiming to act in the name of the public good, engaged here in a destructive struggle for power. This struggle, Thucydides says, resulted in the most appalling atrocities and the most severe punishments, quote, beyond anything required by justice or civic interest, unquote. The parties all claim to act in the public interest, but in fact, this very public, Thucydides says, was, quote, their ultimate prize, unquote. Citizens who had remained neutral were destroyed either for failing to join the cause or out of resentment at their survival. Factionalism undermined familial trust, destroyed the civic bond, and showed human nature for what it really was, quote, a slave of passions and a stronger force than justice, unquote. And if you think it's okay for human nature to be a slave of passions, you shouldn't be here tonight. While more cautious in distinguishing the term part from faction, Roman historiography also contains harsh warnings of the potential for civic discord fueled by partisan disputes. Here, the terms part and party are mostly invoked in a descriptive fashion to denote different parts in court, or in political contexts, different groups of people gathered around different leaders with distinctive goals. So when Cicero writes in the Republica that the tribunate of Tiberius Gracchus had divided one people into two parts, duas partes, or when Sallust explains the difference between patricians and plebeians as a difference between two parts of the political community, the term again has a neutral meaning. Faction, on the other hand, always circulated as a pejorative. And in this case, the transition from the neutral to the derogatory use of the term is easier to explain. Factia was deployed first in Roman comedies, for example in Plautus, to indicate a certain way of doing things, capacity to get things done, or even more accurately, influence, exercised by agents who were more powerful than others by virtue of their birth rank, wealth, or social status. In political settings, the term was made popular by Sallust in his Jugurthine War to indicate the contrast between an aristocratic faction that concentrated wealth and influence and the power of a dispersed mass of people. So it wasn't surprising, if we think of the etymology of the term, that Sallust referred to partisanship and factionalism as vicious practices. Factionalism, he argued, destroyed the initial balance of mutual consideration and restraint that characterized the previous years of the Republic. During these previous glorious years, he stressed, among the citizens there was no struggle for glory and domination. The emergence of factions brought with it greed without moderation and devastated everything, considered nothing valuable or sacred, quote, until it brought about its own collapse, unquote. It's worth noticing that the term factio wasn't used by Sallust to denote an abstract political agent, in a way we understand the term when we talk about partisan factions, but the tendency to concentrate individual influence in a narrow group with self-serving aims. Following the same path, Cicero, in the Republica, gave the term an even more specific and enduring political connotation. Here, factio was used to refer to a group that is formed when certain individuals, because of their wealth or family or other resources, control the commonwealth. And although they call themselves the best people, optimates, they are, in fact, the worst. The link between factionalism and a degenerate form of aristocratic rule remained relatively persistent and continued to be associated with the destruction of a political community. We find it, for example, in Augustine's City of God, when he argues, paraphrasing Cicero, that a faction is nothing more than the unjust form in which rule by the best tends to degenerate. And again here, when such unjust rule holds the city, Augustine emphasizes, the political community is not merely flawed, quote, but ceases altogether to be, unquote. So we find already in these early definitions the most important themes around which subsequent critiques of parties and partisanship tend to concentrate. The purely destructive tendencies contained in factional divides, the detrimental effects of partisan selfishness, the potential for domination contained in the unilateral exercise of power, and so on. What is even more interesting and relevant for my purposes is the idea that equates factions to depraved political groups, groups that are supposed to embody the best people responsible for ruling the city, but have instead concentrated wealth and power and use it only to advance their own purposes. So factions represent a corrupt display of partisan passions, triggered by arrogance, envy, and the desire to accumulate wealth. They lead to the explosion of destructive conflicts between opposing parts of the city. Here, the difference between partisanship and factionalism, as I said, is only one of degree rather than kind. And in fact, the gradual escalation of one into the other is well captured in a very famous passage from Machiavelli's Discourses, sketching the phenomenology of civil strife, where he says that conflicts between individuals generate offense, offense generates fear, fear seeks for defense they procure partisans, from partisans arise the parties in the cities, and from parties their ruin. During the 18th century, however, the term party emerged to refer to a different kind of political agent, an agent that had a claim to embody the will of the people and represent it in the state. Despite this, and this is something I'm going to talk about in a minute, anxiety over the undue effects of their influence over the rest of the political community has been one of the most enduring aspects of the critique of partisanship. The tendency to equate partisanship with oligarchy, or rule by the few, is echoed in Alexander Pope's definition of party spirit as the madness of many for the gain of the few. Or in Moshe Ostrogowski's admonition that as soon as a party is formed, even if it's created for a noblest object, it tends to degeneration. Or in Robert Mischel's reminder that the tendency to oligarchy is inherent in all party organizations. So as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, those who sought to resist this critique did so by defending the fact that partisanship was actually not reducible to partial interest. What they said is that if a party is not a part capable of governing for the sake of the whole, that is, in view of a general interest, then it's no different from a faction. Although a party only represents a part, this part, they said, must take a non-partial approach to the whole. But do their defenses succeed? What exactly does it mean for a part to take a non-partial approach to the whole? Under what conditions is it possible for it to do so? And what is most relevant for my purposes, are these conditions themselves subject to partisan dispute? That parties should exhibit a non-partial commitment to the whole might sound like an oxymoron. Critics of partisanship have long pointed out the apparent, or maybe not so apparent, inconsistency. Indeed, nowhere is this critique captured better than in Rousseau's famous discussion of partial associations as an obstacle to the development of the general will, a discussion that takes shape in the famous section of the social contract called Whether the General Will Can Err. Here, as is well known, Rousseau develops a distinction between the general will and the will of all. The first, the volonté générale, is organic and committed to the good of the whole community. The second is aggregative, only focused on private interests and merely replicating a sum of these interests. So it's in this context that Rousseau emphasizes how partial associations exacerbate the will of all and undermine the general will. When these partial associations arise, he argues, small associations emerge at the expense of the large association, and the will of each of one of these associations becomes general in relation to its members, and particular in relation to the state. And when one of these associations grows so much that it ends up prevailing over the others, there is no longer a general will, he says, and the opinion that prevails is nothing but private opinion. So if partial associations undermine the general will, the latter can only be expressed, the general will that is, if the former are abolished. And so, as Rousseau famously notes, it is crucial that in order to have the general will expressed well, there be no partial society in the state, and every citizen express only his own opinion. Now, Rousseau's analysis is a culmination of a long-standing tradition of similar complaints about difficulties with promoting the good of the whole, which requires commitment to reason, and the disruption caused by partial association, which is in turn coinciding with commitment to passions. I don't know what commitment to passion means, but pursuing passions. Before Rousseau, Hobbes had also warned of the incompatibility of all partisan associations with the exercise of sovereign power. All uniting of strength by private men, Hobbes said, is, if for evil intent, unjust, if for intent unknown, dangerous to the public and unjustly concealed. Factions for Hobbes are unjust because they undermine the peace and safety of the people and take the sword out of the hands of the sovereign. Now, some people like Locke didn't have a problem with taking the sword out of the hands of the sovereign, but even them, even though they thought that occasionally there is nothing wrong with the right to resist, especially if the sovereign is an unjust tyrant, were careful to point out that the right to resist belongs to people as a whole. Such right to resist, Locke insisted, could not be exercised as long as it shall please a busy head or turbulent spirit to desire the alteration of government. Indeed, Locke pointed out that factions have been fatal to states and kingdoms, and that such divisive attempts only contributed to partisans' own just ruin and perdition. Now, it's tempting to dismiss this Hobbesian and Rousseauian critique of parties as an implausible and by now also outdated instance of totalitarian and dogmatic commitment to a unitary view of the political world, a view that is hostile to conflict and rejects pluralism and change as undesirable features of human interaction. One might say, for example, that Rousseau's critique of partisanship comes from a utopian belief in the possibility of realizing a perfect society, a society above conflicts, whose peace can be delivered only by a divine legislator or mythical founder. So it might seem now that insofar as pluralism about conception of what is good for the political community is taken for granted, conflict and change are unavoidable features of human life. So this, call it totalitarian critique, might then be thought to undermine pluralism and try to suppress natural differences among human beings. So this critique of partisanship might seem to us, and has been considered to be, anti-political. And its anti-political stance might seem to come from the belief in the possibility of identifying a public good without granting that conflict between parties makes an important contribution to the process through which that good is articulated. And so all parties are thought of as factions, and all factions are rejected as divisive. But I think the temptation to dismiss this critique of partisanship and factions as anti-political must be resisted. And in fact, I think the critique of partisanship should be taken very seriously. There is a reason for why many authors in the history of political thought have often struggled to distinguish between factions and a more honorable form of political division. And the arguments they provide in motivating that difficulty are not implausible. In fact, I want to go even further and suggest that when defenders of partisanship distinguish between parties and factions, it's because they themselves are implicitly and sometimes explicitly acknowledging the force of the critics. That implicit recognition, however, needs to be brought out more clearly and, where necessary, needs to be defended. So, skepticism of partisanship is of course motivated by the concern with stasis and the disruptive threat that factional strife, as I said, poses to the political community. But skepticism towards the value of partisanship has not so much to do with fear of political conflict as such. It has to do more with an attempt to reflect critically on how political conflict ought to be channeled so that no group ends up prevailing on others and committing an injustice. Therefore, I think, rather than eliminating conflict altogether, the critics of partisanship reflect on how it is possible to regulate it in such a way that different parts can interact with each other in the right way. Indeed, the order between parts is exactly what Plato, for example, and many others since, thought was the essence of justice. Order here doesn't mean that all sources of conflict are abolished. If they were, one wouldn't need justice at all. But if justice is needed to allow all parts of the political community to pursue their ends without one prevailing over the others, justice itself cannot be conceived as the mere outcome of partisan conflict. If what is required to regulate conflict were itself the outcome of that conflict, justice would simply reflect the interests of whoever prevails in the conflict. Or, to put it differently, justice would simply end up being defined as the interest of the stronger party. The problem with unconstrained partisanship is that it runs the risk of turning justice into a mere instrument of power politics. And power politics helps no one, not even those who might initially benefit from it. But notice that in articulating this view, critics of partisanship don't ignore political conflict or express an anti-political stance, as many who denounce the totalitarian tendencies of the critique of partisanship would have it. On the contrary, it is because conflict is taken so seriously that the problem of justice, as that which is required to prevent conflict from becoming an ongoing source of domination, becomes such a pressing one. Let me explain a bit more. As we saw earlier, the term faction circulated in the ancient world, always in connection to the abuse of power by a particular group of citizens who is supposed to rule in the name of the whole people and instead uses its strength and position to advance its own self-interest. Plato's account of what the degeneration of what is supposed to be ruled by the best, aristocracy, in ruled by the few, oligarchy, in the Republic, is here one of the paradigmatic examples of factional accumulation of power. This example is also one to which many authors, from Cicero to Augustine and from Hobbes to Rousseau, continue to refer. In a political community where different groups have distinctive and often conflicting interests, the accumulation of offices and wealth, the growth of private property, which exacerbates comparisons between citizens, and the envy and mutual hostility that result from such comparisons risk driving animosities between groups in a destructive direction. Those with more money and titles end up occupying more advantageous offices and positions and make laws that exclude the many who are only seen as means to promote their own self-interest. Public decisions are then corrupted by those special interests that enter the political sphere, and the general will no longer tracks what is right. As Rousseau puts it in a passage of the Discourse on Political Economy, public deliberation and the general will would coincide, except they don't, if the people is seduced by private interest that some few skillful men succeed by their either reputation or eloquence or wealth to substitute for the people's own interest. If justice is reduced to whatever results from political conflict, justice ends up serving the interests of the stronger party. And if justice serves the interests of the stronger party, it can only exacerbate conflict, not regulate it. Defenders of partisanship tend to denounce the critique that I have just outlined as the product of a kind of simple failure to appreciate the positive value of partisanship and its contribution to political circumstances where pluralism characterizes political life. I think, however, that on the contrary, the concern with justice that is reflected in that critique is plausible. It is particularly plausible if we keep in mind the destructive form that partisan conflict can take if a plurality of interests confronts each other in the political sphere without distinguishing between more or less reasonable instances of disagreement, even when we accept that disagreement is unavoidable. In fact, especially if we accept that disagreement is unavoidable. So justice, critics of partisanship say, is necessary for an impartial adjudication of the relation between different interests in society. It is necessary to contain the destructive form that conflict between different parts of society can take if interests enter the political sphere entirely unmediated by principles. It's therefore essential to reflect on how the interests of particular groups fit with a collective attempt to express and regulate the relation between such interests through principles of justice. It is essential because we want to prevent the political sphere from becoming a realm of domination of the weaker party by the stronger party. And we want to prevent it from becoming a realm where partisan disputes are difficult to distinguish from factional strife. So it might be worth, having said what I think is plausible in the critique, to revisit Rousseau's famous account of partial associations with which I started to see if we can now reinterpret it. It is standard practice, as I said, to dismiss Rousseau's account as a form of quasi-totalitarian, or even not quasi, full-blown totalitarian, mocking of essential and unavoidable pluralism. But as I tried to show, his thoughts are in fact much more nuanced. In the very section of the social contract where his apparent hostility to parties is expressed, the anti-partisan argument is qualified in a relatively little-known footnote, which refers to Machiavelli's distinction between different kinds of division in a political community. Vero è, I'm not continuing Italian, the truth is, Machiavelli had argued in the Florentine histories that some divisions harm republics and some benefit them. Harmful are those that are accompanied by factions and parties. Beneficial are those that do not give rise to factions and parties. But since he continues, this Machiavelli now, the legislator knows that conflicts and enmities are unavoidable, he must make the best provision possible against factions, and so he says relatively little about parties. In citing these same passages, Rousseau also recommends, in a similar way to Machiavelli, that if there are partial associations, their number must be multiplied and inequality among them must be prevented, as was done by Solon, Numa, and Servius. The real problem for Rousseau, as one can see here, is not with partisanship per se, but with the conditions under which a just interactions among partisans is possible. And interestingly, the answer to the problem consists not in establishing laws that suppress these differences, but in correcting inequalities between parts, such that no partisan group can prevail over the others. Indeed, the examples of successful legislators that Rousseau brings, such as Solon, Numa, and so on, are far from indicating his approval of reforms that sought to abolish partisanship. It's quite the opposite. They are not the expression of anti-partisanship, but a sign that he takes it very seriously. Solon's famous anti-partisanship law condemned to loss of citizenship all those citizens who, in times of civil strife, refused to join one of the struggling parties. It was a law that intended to pluralize political opposition, not to eliminate it, and he did so by asking people not to bracket from their political disagreements, but to bring them out in the public sphere. Once conflict is acknowledged as unavoidable, the way to correct the general will from making mistakes is to correct inequalities between parts and to ensure that a plurality of associations can flourish under conditions that prevent some from becoming a source of domination for others. For that, however, one needs principles of justice. And yet, those principles of justice cannot themselves emerge from unconstrained partisan dispute. They need to be formulated under the right conditions by groups that are motivated by general rather than particular interests. And they need to abstract from particularistic interests and goals. Where asymmetries of position, wealth, and opportunities define particular groups and are left unconstrained, they end up becoming a source of inequality, threatening the integrity of the general will. So this concern with the wealth of the political community as a whole, and the idea that partisan divides run the risk of fueling destructive conflict unless they find a place in a political system that accommodates the humors, we might say, with Machiavelli of different parts of the citizenry, is actually central to a certain kind of a republican freedom by which Rousseau was inspired. Machiavelli's argument that the conflict between the umori of different classes, the people on the one hand and the great on the other, were one of the main causes that preserved the freedom of Rome. And this is often defended as a proto-defense of partisanship without parties, although Machiavelli never mentions parties. And so the distinction between divisions that harm the republic and divisions that protect them is central to making this point and to the preservation of republican freedom. As Machiavelli puts it, there are two ways of acquiring influence and reputation, either by public ways or by private modes. The latter entails benefiting this or that private citizen, private ways, defending him from the magistrates, helping him with money, getting him unmerited honors, and ingratiating oneself with the plebs with games and public gifts. You might be familiar with some of these forms, not with the term plebs, but the rest I think is relatively known. From this latter mode of proceeding, sects and partisans arise, and the reputation thus earned offends. The other kind of reputation instead, that which is mixed with parties, is founded on a common good, not on a private good. We find a common thread in the reflections of Machiavelli and Rousseau. And interestingly, we find this common thread despite the fact that the first, Machiavelli, is often caricatured as a political realist, and the second, Rousseau, is often caricatured as a political moralist who puts morality and prioritizes it to political action. Machiavelli inspired Rousseau because he was concerned with the corrupting effects of inequalities of honors, titles, wealth, and influence, with the ability of the rich to manipulate public officials, and the use of bribery and clientelism as a way of obtaining private favors. His emphasis on republican freedom as a system of rule, where the many are protected from domination by the few, suggests a similar concern with the problem of inequality of influence and with the corrupting power of unconstrained wealth with which factionalism was identified. Without remedying such pathologies, Machiavelli stressed, rule by the people struggles to become a meaningful vehicle of political participation and remains an instrument in the hands of powerful elites. So to sum up, the just framework of interaction between parts is required to avoid that inevitable conflicts among human beings become purely destructive. When I said to sum up, I meant just to sum up this part about Machiavelli and Rousseau, not that the whole thing is over, so bear with me for a bit longer. If political institutions are arranged so as to reflect norms of honorable confrontation and exchange of principled alternatives, and if citizens abstract from selfish and self-referential needs and aims in articulating their concerns and commitments, a fair mechanism for regulating conflict becomes available. This is not to exclude that interests are part of politics, or that disagreements on points of principle will persist even once such efforts of advancing interpretations of a public good are in place. Indeed, this is, I think, what is exactly at stake in the apparently paradoxical idea that parties should seek to articulate a non-partial view of the whole. That idea acknowledges that pluralism and conflicts are unavoidable, but does not thereby entail that all conflicts should be relativized and applauded without constraints. If such conflicts can be channeled by appealing to reasons that can be generally shared, partisanship becomes a vehicle for generating public justifications of one's views rather than a mechanism that just represents groups' interests. In that case, pluralism and disagreements become productive rather than destructive. They contribute to undermine the public good, to promote the public good rather than undermining it. This, I take it, is also at the heart of the distinction between partisanship and factionalism that many defenders of partisanship try to articulate. And this is also why the critique of partisanship, even in the extreme form it's usually taken to be offered by Rousseau, is not as wildly implausible as you might think. By acknowledging that there are different kinds of division in the political community, some that harm them and some that benefit them, we see that two different understandings of pluralism emerge. Their weight and relevance is not equal. The first is a pluralism of interests which are left unmediated, belong to functionally differentiated groups or classes in society, and if they are left untempered, they contain the potential for domination and destruction of one group or social class by another. The second one is a kind of pluralism of principles, premised on the idea that disagreements are unavoidable, even among well-intentioned people, and requiring agents able to channel them in the right way. This idea, as I will now go on to show, is in fact central to the distinction between parties and factions and to the defense of political parties as key agents in the modern representative system. And in some ways points to a tension within the modern representative system, but I'll say something about that at the very end. So the notion of parties as essential political agents indispensable to the formation of a general will is essentially a modern phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that can only be understood if we also understand the nature of the link between the justification of the modern state and the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means that the people are not just coerced by the laws that they comply with, but that they're also authors of such laws. However, this idea of the collective will of the people, a will which is realized through abstract political institutions, requires a distinctive kind of political agent in order to be articulated. It's a kind of agent able to represent everyone in a way that speaks to their concerns and commitments, but also that connects them to a civic project which is not reduced to the partial interests of the different groups that make up the political community. And this is exactly how the modern idea of popular sovereignty came to be established, and it is also why the best way of understanding parties as partial agents is that of understanding them as partial agents that make a non-partial contribution to articulating the good of the whole. The exercise of popular sovereignty, the idea of rule by the people, of course admits of conflicts on matters of principle. But such conflicts have to go beyond a mere confrontation of private interests and the attempt of particular groups to use the state to their advantage. Once the fundamental equality of all human beings is acknowledged, if only in principle, without restrictions to birth rank, religious affiliation, or social status, affirming the power of the state on everyone in the territory depends on the existence of agents able to align a plurality of positions on principle and guaranteeing them universal representation whilst also tolerating their differences. Only thanks to a similar mechanism, grounded on associative practices, through which individual views could be organized in conformity with a plurality of interpretations of the public good, could the promise of rule by the people be effectively discharged. It is precisely from the necessity of this link between the universal and the particular, a link essential to rendering meaningful the idea of the people as sovereign, that the modern concept of partisanship became inextricably linked to the preservation of values like justice and order in a political community. So when liberals in the 19th century defended the modern party system, liberals like Burke and Bluntschli, and liberals like Rawls later on, they did so by linking the defense of partisanship to an emphasis on the difference between the state on the one hand and society on the other. The state was different from the particular groups whose interests it had to regulate. It could represent the latter, but it stood above them. And it was precisely the acknowledgement of this superiority that allowed the plurality of parts to coexist and contribute to justice and order in the political community. If parties were essential to the life of a free state, it is because they accepted the partiality of their own position within it. If they distinguished themselves from factions, it is because they agreed that the perspectives that they helped shape, articulate, and channel were not reducible to the private interests of their associates, but in accordance with general, even if contested, interpretations of the public good. So how plausible was this 19th century defense of partisanship, or even the 20th century one? As we saw, it was a defense premised on the idea that the state was abstract from society and superior to it. It was a defense premised on the idea that political institutions, courts, civil associations, you name it, together contributed to realizing the promise of popular sovereignty if their relation was regulated in the right way. It was a defense premised on the idea that the laws could be shaped independently from the particular interests of the social groups from whose conflicts the state had emerged, and one might think historically of the relevance of the nobility, the clergy, regionalist groups, different economic classes, and so on. Now, of course, these were all propositions that many critics continued to doubt. In fact, far from becoming obsolete, the party-faction distinction and the assimilation of one to the other continued to be invoked each time that ideal, that's to say the ideal of the separation of the state from society and from particular interest groups, was challenged. So the specter of factionalism continued to haunt partisanship anytime the state was accused of being, for example, no more than a committee for managing the affairs of a bourgeoisie, anytime the purpose of government was declared to be the avoidance of permanent majorities, anytime the ideal of popular sovereignty was mocked for being just an idle aspiration that never actually worked. A good example of the ongoing relevance of the critique of partisanship and the assimilation of partisan factions, even after parties had emerged as the modern phenomenon that we know, are James Madison's reflection on the topic. They challenge the very possibility of distinguishing between divisions of principle and divisions of interest. As long as the reason of man continues to be fallible, these are Madison's words, and as long as man is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other, and the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. This difference between different reasons and abilities and passions is then manifested, Madison says, in different claims to property that different abilities give rise to. And now, once different degrees of property emerge, Madison argued, a division of the society into different interest groups and parties also follows. And once parties are formed following different views and concentrated around different leaders and groups, the animosities that accompany them render people much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for the common good. So the state and society, again, become difficult to distinguish from each other. Now, why does all this happen? And here Madison's diagnosis interestingly coincides with that of Rousseau. The most common and durable source of factions have been the various unequal distributions of property. However, Madison disagreed with Rousseau on the remedy. He believed that it was both impracticable and unwise to seek to remove the cause of factional divides that were sown in the very nature of man. And the more detailed prescriptions he provided on the remedy are a familiar part of the institutional response to conflicts between parts. Separation of powers, due process, respect for fundamental rights, rule of law. But now, I think it's an open question on whether such remedies alone are sufficient to render conflict between partisans ordered rather than destructive. In fact, as I try to suggest, Rousseau might have been right to insist that without overall justice and attending to the causes, not just the effects of inequality, partial associations end up becoming a vehicle of domination. The general will is likely to err, and popular sovereignty remains just an aspiration. So, whatever one makes of Rousseau's argument, and also of my sympathies to Rousseau, you might think I account by my Albanianism for them. This challenge, I think, is precisely what is at stake in the distinction between partisanship and factionalism, and on our assessment on how tenable this distinction is. Now, contemporary critics of parties and partisanship and of the role of partisan competition in liberal democracies suggest that the distinction between parties and factions as a distinction in kind is actually not very tenable. What their arguments indicate is that institutional remedies limited to correcting the effect rather than the cause of inequalities are not enough. That without attending to the system of production of such inequalities, private influence will continue to corrupt political institutions. When that is the case, parties, like old factions, act in collusion with the political system that is dominated by modern oligarchies and ends up sacrificing the many to the interests of the few. So in the US, for example, such anti-party skepticism often takes the form of critiques to campaign finance, suggestions for improvement in electoral advertising, or accusations of undue influence by corporate lobbyists on political elites. And if you have ever watched West Wing, like Jonathan and I sometimes do, you'll have a very clear sense of what this is about. In Western Europe, recent analysis of the constraints that fiscal pressure put by liberal financial institutions places on democratic governments also highlight the obstacles that political parties face in standing by anything other than the politics of austerity required by particular interest groups. So, more than ever today, economic power seems to have become political power. Citizens are losing more and more of their democratic defenses. Their ability to connect their interpretations of the public good to the workings of political institutions is significantly undermined. Political institutions, whether transnational or national, seem to cater increasingly to the needs of financial markets. Capital owners, banks, apologies to the bankers among you. Actually, no, I don't want to apologize. These policies leave those with less influence and wealth unable to impress their voice in the political process. Factionalism, understood in the classical sense as the unequal influence that those with more power and wealth exercise over the rest of the political community, continues to haunt principled partisan politics. The defense of parties as agents responsible for articulating particular interpretations of the public good seems more than ever vulnerable to being distorted by the pressure of external, often market-driven factors and forces. On the other hand, the state seems unable to incorporate these in a way that maintains the promise of collective rule and that realizes the ideal of popular sovereignty. The difficulties with coping with modern stasis, the crisis of contemporary liberal democracy, appear to show once again the persistent challenge of making good on the party's claim to be agents irreducible to particular interests. So I'm now coming to a conclusion. The distinction between parties and factions is as important to assert the value of partisanship as the assimilation between the two concepts is to detract from it. Advocates of partisanship, as we saw, tend to highlight the importance of principled disagreement, arguing that partisanship requires taking a non-partial approach to the public good and acknowledging the contribution that parts can make to the articulation of a general will. Critics, on the other hand, stress that the difference between factions and partisanship depends on the background circumstances under which different political groups operate. Their hostility to partisanship, I try to argue, comes from a plausible critique of accumulation of power, including wealth and office, and of its implications for the relation between different groups. It is a critique that highlights the relevance of background constraints, one foremost among them, the reduction of inequalities of power, required for partisanship to become a vehicle for channeling the general will, rather than a vehicle for channeling factional interests. So, while the distinction between parties and factions remains important and appears inextricable from the development of the ideal and the promise of popular sovereignty, the reality of partisanship often fails to live up to that ideal. That is, of course, no reason for abandoning the ideal. In fact, that's usually when things become particularly interesting for philosophers and political theorists, when a political agent is on the verge of degeneration. It's no reason to stop believing in the ideal of partisanship based on principles. But nor should our attachment to that ideal render us blind to the importance of Machiavelli's distinction between divisions that harm republics and divisions that are beneficial to them. As I try to show, the critics of partisanship might be right that in the absence of background constraints regulating political conflict, the ideal of active citizenship that is nurtured by partisan practices ends up being undermined rather than cultivated. You might wonder what kind of background constraints these are, and I think to establish these constraints, one needs a different account of the relation between civil society and the state, a more radical theory of justice that is different from the kind of justice the institutions of liberal democracy have made available to us. But if you want to know more about what kind of theory that will be and how the world will become better and greater with the help of it, you'll have to wait for my next Beirat lecture. Thank you.